Well, good morning. It's good to see you this morning. Glad everyone made it here this morning. And even though it's cold outside, it's warm in here. We're glad that you are here and made certain that you were here this morning for this lesson. I've entitled this morning's lesson, Why Worship God? The world doesn't understand why we worship God. The world would rather forget there is a God for the most part. Most of the world don't want to believe in God, because to believe in God, to acknowledge there's a God, means that you must obey. You must submit. That's why some people are so stubborn about admitting that there's a God, is because by the mere fact that you acknowledge that God exists, you acknowledge you must submit, you must obey, and that there is one in charge. And most men, they just rather be in charge of themselves. They can handle things themselves. And that's how a lot of people think. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And they don't understand, why do we have to worship God? Well, if you want me to worship God, then I've got some questions for you, the world would say. Why does God allow such and such to happen? Why doesn't God stop this? Why doesn't God make us do this and do that? And the list goes on, trying to make and formulate excuses of why we don't have to follow God, or we shouldn't have to follow God. And that is ridiculous. And we're going to talk about some of those things here in just a moment. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, Exodus 20 and verse 3, God clearly tells them, He says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." That doesn't mean other gods exist. It just means you don't create anything that is going to come before me. Period. And what do we find that the world does? The world creates its own gods. For some it's money, for some it's actually some kind of a deity off somewhere. We've got Greek mythology, we've got the Romans taking on the Greek mythology because they thought it was intriguing, and then we've got the Norse gods such as Thor and others around the world. We've got the Hindu gods, we've got Buddha, we've got all kinds of things around the world. Man has created God anyway, out of his imagination and his desire to recognize that there is something greater than me. And that's what it boils down to. Man innately looks for that which is greater than himself, because in his mind, in his heart, he understands there is and there must be something greater than me. 3 times we're told that God is great. 3 times, well, more than that, but I've got 3 times for you here. 1 Chronicles chapter 16 verse 25 says, "For great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. He also is to be feared above all gods." Why did God say that? Because at this time there were many false gods out there. The Amorites had their gods, the Hittites had theirs, and so on, so the list goes on. Dagon was one, the Philistines had their gods. Psalms 145 verse 3 says, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised." Notice that's repeating this phrase. And his greatness is unsearchable. In other words, you can't understand how vast and powerful God really is. You could not understand it. Psalms 96 verse 4. "For the Lord is great and greatly to be praised." Look how many times that exact phrase is being used. He is to be feared above all gods. You know, the scientists have just now come up with something interesting, and they're willing to admit it. They've put this new telescope out there, and they're using it, and it's showing even better pictures than they had before. And now they're able to track the galaxies that they can see off in the distance. And they've now concluded that 95% of all these galaxies, the universe is so vast, so big, 95% of them will never be within our reach. We can never travel to them. Because even if we started down and traveled at the speed of light, which we cannot do at this time, we'd never be able to reach them because they're moving away. The universe is getting bigger. They're willing to admit these things. They're willing to acknowledge a lot of the things that they believed totally different about not too long ago. Constantly they're proving more and more that there is a God. You see, God is above all gods that man can imagine. That's why we find these statements that He is to be feared. That means reverenced and respected above all other gods. Because in reality, there are no other gods. There's only one God. Only one God. In Psalms 95 and verse 3, 95 and verse 3, it says, "For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods." In other words, He's in charge. He's above everybody. You might have your gods, but God's over that God. He's above him. He's greater than him. How many times did He prove that with Dagon? They put the ark in Dagon's temple, and Dagon kept getting knocked out the door, and finally just broke him in half. God would not stand for it. They brought plagues upon them, and they finally just said, "We got to get rid of this thing," and they took it and sent it back. They didn't want it anymore. God is truly above all gods. Man naturally knows there is something greater than himself, and he tries to create these representations of what he cannot know and cannot understand. In Acts chapter 10, verse 25, Acts chapter 10, verse 25, we find that Peter is talking, and he's talking with Cornelius. And as Peter was coming in, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshipped him. See, Cornelius didn't know any better. Peter said, "No, stop." But he took him up and saying, "Stand up. Stand up. I myself also am a man." Men are not to be worshipped, yet we find that men in some parts of the world love to have that worship and almost demand it. Okay, we can find references to that in the scriptures as well, can't we? Remember that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They refused to worship the king. Ultimately, that king changed his mind, didn't he? We're not to worship men. Angels, we're not to worship either. Okay? In Revelation chapter 19, verse 10, and chapter 22, verse 9, angels they refused to be worshipped. "I'm a fellow servant just as you are." Even spiritual beings are refused to be worshipped. Well, there's something here that we're being shown something. Angels worship God. Angels acknowledge that God is to be worshipped. Every time we find an angel that's mentioned in the Bible that talks about worshiping God, they worship Him. They serve Him. They do as He tells them to do. You see, man can't understand. Man cannot grasp, cannot attain into the wisdom of God whatsoever. All the knowledge that man thinks that he's acquired through time, God already knew. God already knew it. Because the things that we find follow specific patterns and laws, and they cannot just happen by chance. They were put together in that fashion by God, who knew how they operated. Now, Isaiah 55 and verse 8. Isaiah 55 and verse 8 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and neither your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. He understands things. He sees things. He grasps things. We cannot attain into His great, vast knowledge. And we should not be trying to create a likeness like unto Him. There's a reason God said don't do that. Thou shalt not have any graven image. Why? Because you can't see me. You couldn't understand me. You can't understand my thoughts. What makes you think you can create me in the shape of who I am? We can't. We can't do that. We cannot even attain into His wisdom. How could we create an image of something we cannot fully understand? We can't. In man's effort to explain what he doesn't understand or control, he has created then his own gods. Remember the golden calf the Hebrews created? He convinced Aaron to do that. Oh, God was not happy about that, was He? Not happy at all. They continually wanted to make idols like everybody else around. Bring God down to our level. Bring Him to our level. Make Him equal to us. Make Him in a graven image. That makes us greater than Him. But God says, no, those things, they can't even hear or see. Look in Psalms 135 and verse 15. Psalms 135, starting with verse 15. It's talking about these idols that man creates. The idols of the heathen are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they speak not. Eyes have they, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Neither is there any breath in their nostrils or their mouths. They that make them are like unto them. So is every one that trusteth in them. They're nothing. It means you amount to nothing. Your life amounts to nothing if you worship these things. Don't do that. We see an example of this in Baal, worshiping Baal. Remember? The worshipers of Baal, how they prayed unto Baal to light the altar, set it on fire. They cut themselves, cried, moaned, groaned, and Elijah just said, well, yell a little louder. Maybe he's fallen asleep. Or maybe he doesn't hear what's going on. Maybe he's off somewhere doing something. Making light of the situation, the fact that he knew and understood there was no God named Baal. Okay? There is no God. There are no other gods. And it's a humorous situation, but a very serious one, because it points out the fact that there is no other God. And of course, God's prophet prayed unto him one time. And God did more than he even asked him to do. He lit the altar. Fire came down from heaven. But it not only consumed the altar, but it consumed all of the water there intended to protect everyone. God has given us plenty of examples to help us understand there are no other gods. We are not to worship anyone or anything else except God. Yet man wants to know why. Why? Why do we have to worship God? Well, Jesus tells us we are to worship God alone and Him alone. Look at Matthew chapter 4 and verse 10. The devil had challenged him, and Jesus is talking to him. Then saith Jesus unto him, Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and Him only shalt thou serve. He is the only one because He is the only one. We can find in Thessalonians where man sets himself up, an evil man would set himself up in his own heart as he's God or equal to God, and trust in his own abilities, trust in things around him. Ignoring God, saying, I don't need God. Beloved, we need God. We need Him every single day, whether we choose to admit it or not. Life would not exist without God. God is worthy of worship because He is the creator of all things. He created you. He created this world we live in. The sun, the moon, the stars, the birds in the air. The list goes on and on and on of all the things He has created, things we haven't even seen, things we can't even understand. God has created them, and they all work fitly, rightly joined together in the fashion which God created them. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was God. And we all read the creation story, how He created all things, even man himself. Then we turn to John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, and we find that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. He has the right of worship for creation alone, for being the Creator. He deserves worship for so many more reasons than that. In Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11, we find very clearly that God created the heaven and the earth. In Exodus chapter 20 verse 11 it says, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day." God's telling us, you exist because I created you. This world exists because I created it. We can turn over to Colossians and we can find where His very words, the words that He speaks, He upholds everything in its existence and makes it all function as He chooses it to do, simply by His words alone. And Paul tells us that we live and have our very being in God. You need to listen carefully to what he's saying. Life exists because of God. Turn with me to Acts chapter 17, verse 24. Acts chapter 17 and verse 24. Listen to what Paul's saying. He's on Mars Hill. He's talking to the ones that they're in Athens, and they're on Mars Hill worshiping these false gods. And he says, the unknown God, I'm going to declare Him to you. Listen to what he says, starting with verse 24. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that He is Lord of heaven and earth, He reigns over it by right of creation, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. He's not a God like what you've been worshiping. He's not like one of these statues you've got over here, guys. He doesn't dwell in earthly dwellings. He created all that you see. He created all of the heavens and the earth. He created you. He doesn't dwell in a house created by you. For in Him, are you listening? In Him we live. We exist. We have our existence and move and have our very being. As certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also His offspring. In other words, your own poets have talked about what I'm talking about. They've acknowledged there's something greater than what we can see and understand. We live, we move, and we have our very being because God is here. You exist. You woke up this morning. You can breathe. You can have the food that you eat, the air you breathe. Gravity works. Light works. Everything that you can think of is existing because God allowed it today. By that right alone, He deserves to be worshipped. Because of who you are and Him creating you in Psalms 139, in secret, you formed me in my mother's womb. You knew all of my elements and my parts. In secret, you knew my downsetting, my uprising. You knew every word I would ever say. God knows you. God is outside of time. He exists outside of time. All the elements we know and understand that make our world function the way it does, God is outside of those things because He created those things. Just like if we have a pocket watch or a clock, the creator that created it is outside of that clock. God is outside of this world and this time. We live and we breathe, we move, we exist in Him because He allows it to be. He's far greater than we can imagine, stronger than we can conceive. And yet this God that does all these things has taken time to say, I love you. He's taken time to consider each and every one of us. He knows every hair upon our head. He knows our name. He knows our thoughts, our words, what we're going to say, what we're going to do. A God that has taken such great interest in you individually is a God that's worthy of your love, worthy of listening to and paying attention to. He is worthy of all praise because we are created for His pleasure. In Revelation chapter 4, verses 11, it says, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for Thou hast created all things, and for Thy pleasure they are and were created. He created you out of love for you. And all He asks is for you to love Him back. In Jeremiah 29, verse 11, we're told by God, He says, For I know the thoughts I think towards you. I know what I've thought about you, how I feel about you, saith the Lord. Thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. And what is that expected end? As we read and study the Bible, His Word that He's given us to tell us who we are, who He is, what is expected of us, and what He wants for us. As we read this, we find He wants us to live in all eternity with Him. What a wonderful God we have. He is worthy of our worship simply because He created us, but even more than that, this place that He created for us, this world, the wonderful things that are in it, He created for us. Paul tells us that in Acts. He created the habitation of man. He created the bounds of where man dwells. And we find in Genesis that all the things were created by Him. All the animals, all the plants, everything. He made us like Him. He made us spiritual beings. We are in His image. We have a physical body to dwell on this earth that He created. That's what allows us to be here. But the real you is inside of you. It's a soul, it's a spirit that God has given you that will never die. He created you. Think about that for a minute. He created you, and you have within you the ability to never die, but to live eternally in heaven, in a wonderful place that God has created for you. Have you ever stopped and thought about that for a moment? He watches over us here and now. He provides for us. He protects us through His providence. How many times can we look back in our lives and see times when surely God had to have something to do with that? How did we get out of that situation if God didn't help us? We didn't realize it at the time, but we can look back and we say, surely God has something to do with that. He blesses us. He protects us. He asks us to pray, to talk to Him, to build a relationship with Him so that He can give us the desires of our heart. Ask what you will in my name, to be the Father's good pleasure to give it unto you. Think about that. A God who says, talk to me. Let me know what you need. I'm there for you. What a wonderful God we have. He created heaven for us. I've gone to prepare a place for you that where I am, there you may be also. Purposely creating something just for you. You haven't seen it yet, but it's described as something beautiful beyond your imagination. And He wants us with Him for all eternity. What a wonderful God. surely you can find reason and understanding to know that he deserves to be worshiped. And he does. And we should. We should worship him simply because it's the right thing to do. If you're here this morning and you haven't put your Lord on in baptism, but you desire to go to heaven, this place that he's prepared for you, now's your opportunity to do that, because you can not only get there if you're born again into the kingdom of God. Now's your chance to do that. If you are here this morning and you are a child of God and you need the prayers of the church, we're here for that also. Let us pray for you. Once you come all together, we stand and we invite you in song.